Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I am John Kupar. I'm the associate pastor here at Anchorage Pres. For those of you I don't know or who are not members of Anchorage Pres, thank you for coming out for this wonderful series. This is part 3 of 5, so there are 2 more weeks after this that you could come and join us to hear about a touchy subject, if you will. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Matthew 25 reminds us, and Jesus calls us to serve with and for the least of these, not as a group to be pitied, but as people who are deeply loved by God. We aim to help multiply this loving commitment to radical and fearless discipleship. Following Jesus faithfully means putting love and compassion into action. Tonight, we welcome Tony Curtis. Tony is the executive director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, MHC for short. Prior to that, he worked for 11 years at the Kentucky Historical Society as a public historian and documentary editor. The MHC is a coalition of about 300 individual and organizational members, including nonprofit housing developers, financial institutions, service providers, and neighborhood and advocacy groups, which facilitate research-based advocacy for fair, accessible, and affordable housing in the Louisville area. Tony worked with George Ekelund to prepare this presentation, but George had a medical emergency in his family, so Tony is going at it alone tonight. But Tony brings depth and breadth of knowledge of the challenges facing those who lack a stable, accessible, and affordable housing situation. He seeks to create community solutions as well as advocate before local, state, and federal officials and lawmakers for those in need. So here we are, ready to learn and discuss the realities of our people, of God's people. This is not easy. We never said it would be, but it's what we are called to do. So let us open with prayer. God of the oppressed, your call to follow is difficult. You call us to reorder our lives as expressed in Scripture. Hearing this and knowing this, we still pass by the ones you especially notice. People who are poor, hungry, experiencing homelessness, sick, or imprisoned. We have not stood with those who are hated, bullied, or excluded. Comfortable with the way things are, we are too complacent, even complicit with injustice and prejudice. Forgive us, O God. Stir in us the desire to work for change. Open our hearts so that all may have a place at the table. Amen. Let us welcome Tony.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. We were just having a conversation about how it's Selection Sunday, so we know that's a big deal here in Kentucky, but I appreciate everybody coming out this evening. Like John was saying, I did have a compatriot, George Ekelund from the Coalition for the Homeless. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it this evening, but he did send his apologies, and if you ever want to invite him to do a talk specifically on homelessness, he's more than willing to come back out and have a conversation. So what I wanted to say a little bit about MHC is we've been around since 1989. And we're a research-driven advocacy organization for fair and affordable housing in Louisville. It was actually founded in part by some Presbyterian ministers in 1989. So I wanted to bring tonight some data to show you. There'll be a lot of charts. Hopefully we can see the charts up on the screen. If not, I will send out this PowerPoint to Susan, and Susan can pass it along to everybody who attended this evening. But I wanted to introduce some of this data, how you can advocate, how you can educate, how you can get involved in the community as well. So there'll be some calls for action within this at the local and at the state level. That's my contact information, Tony@metropolitanhousing.org, if you need to reach out to me or would like to reach out to me. I'm going to start with kind of a brief history, and I know you've had this history in a previous presentation on redlining and some of the other causes that we face that cause the affordable housing, the fair housing crisis we have today. Just to do kind of a quick run through, it really starts in 1917 in a Supreme Court case called Buchanan versus Worley, actually coming out of Louisville, Kentucky. And it really overturned months of work in Louisville. There was an attempt in Louisville to codify into the law where black people could live and where white people could live, what block by block, how they could codify that into the law and prevent people from living in certain parts of town. And one thing I want you to keep in mind as we talk through this and look at the maps, look at the data, is that those maps that we're going to see this evening are a living history of what has occurred over the last 100 years, actually many, many years before that, but going back to Buchanan versus Worley. And so the court wasn't really worried about race. They were more worried about contracts is what they were worried about, but it impacted race. And when this court decision came down, Louisville looked for reasons to be able to codify into the law where black people and where white people could live in Louisville. And so they hired a man by the name of Harlan Bartholomew, whose name you may have heard in one of the last presentations, to come in and to really circumvent this Supreme Court ruling and to really enforce segregation in Louisville, which takes us into the 1930s, which is redlining. And I understand that you've had a conversation about redlining already. Won't go into the details of that, but we see in many respects, the lasting legacy of that to this day. And when we start talking about land development code reform, we're talking about the early roots of it in the 1930s, when this was really codified into law. And we're looking at a long history of kind of a change that occurs right after World War II, where we went from a majority renter nation to a majority homeowner nation. And that kind of changed kind of the face of the landscape as far as home ownership in our country. You can read about a lot of this in Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. If you have not read that, that's a great book. We actually had him here in Louisville. I guess it's 4, if not 5 years ago now. Time means nothing anymore because of the pandemic, which I think everybody can understand. But one of the last in-person annual meetings we had Richard Rothstein here talking about that national perspective of housing and how different policies, prohibited the selling of homes to black individuals. It prohibited mortgages being made to black individuals. And it underwrote massive single-family developments here in the United States. We also see the use of deed restrictions, right? Written into the law itself. I'll actually show you an example here. This is an example from the Highlands, Bardstown Road area. And the little red area that I have outlined there says, his property shall never be sold or rented to any person of African descent. So actually codified into the deeds itself, you see these restrictions on who and who cannot purchase and own homes in certain areas of town. This is actually at Douglas Boulevard Christian Church and the, I can't remember the name of the building that's behind it, but this is where that piece of property was, right there in Douglas Loop area of the Highlands. So you see a lot of this movement and a lot of this being embedded into the law and embedded into the very documents that we still see. It wasn't until 1972 that deed restrictions were actually made illegal. So it's a very recent history that we have that this has occurred. So I want to kind of bring you up to today. I just want to kind of give you a little bit of context there, a lot of the kind of the roots of where we're working to kind of overcome this affordable housing, this housing crisis in Louisville. And so in 2019, the city of Louisville and the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund did a study, the housing needs assessment. What housing was needed in Kentucky? What is the quality of the housing stock? What is needed? And so here is one of the overarching things you will see, is that there is great need for all types of housing at all types of incomes. The chart you see, the graph you see here, is showing the need for housing at different area median incomes. So as you move from left to right, you will see in the orange is what is the unmet need right now. So in 2019, people making 30% of area median income, so you're talking about $20,000 a year, there is a need for 31,412 units of affordable housing. If you take that up to 50,000 or 50% area median income, so you're talking about $30,000 a year, the unmet need is another 22,520. So really looking at 50% of area median income and below, there is a need for 55,000 units here in the city of Louisville. And you can see as that goes further and further, there's less and less need as you move up the income brackets. And I wanted to kind of localize this a little bit. They actually did market area studies as a part of that housing needs assessment in 2019. Anchorage itself is in the East Metro market area. You can get it online to the Office of Housing's website. They have all of these market studies done, as well as the full housing needs assessment. And it gives data on various things. You can look at the number of residents by race, so predominantly white area, 81%. The number of housing units, it's about 60% single family versus 30% multifamily. You can also see median income or median home values in the East Metro market area, $235,000 as compared to $174,000 across Louisville, so about a $60,000 above that Louisville median home value. And also the number of people who are cost burdened. You can see that in the kind of on the right side in the middle, about households who pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And you can see in the East Metro area, this region, that 22% of the residents pay more than 30%, which is lower than the 29% for all of Louisville. And then the map here, so you can see, it's on the next slide, sorry, it's on the same page on mine. This is a map of the East Metro market area. And so what this is showing is the number of various things, number of affordable housing units in these developments, 265 units. We're also, let's see, sorry, I'm struggling to read my, there's new single family and multifamily, about 1,200 units were built in this area. And you can just see the need and kind of what the ground level looks like about number of units here. They have 0 homes with visible exterior issues, so they actually did a drive around of all the areas of Louisville and did a visual inspection of housing stock. And 0 subsidized income restricted units in this East Metro market area. And so all of this is available. They do the little market area studies, and it's maybe 3 or 4 pages on each area, and you can compare each of the areas. But that's kind of the East Metro area. And one more thing that they include in there also is the affordability gaps for the area. So you can see kind of that first chart that I showed you was a high-level picture of the need for 55,000 units at 50% and below area median income. What you can see here is the breakdown for the East Metro area, and they're kind of small, so I would urge you to pull that data on the city's website or the Affordable Housing Trust Fund's website to see kind of what that need is here as compared to the larger Louisville area. And so when I was talking about you can see the history of housing discrimination in the maps. So the Metropolitan Housing Coalition publishes a State of Metropolitan Housing Report, every year. So we've done it since 2003. There are 18 years worth of State of Metropolitan Housing Reports. You can download all of those digitally from the Metropolitan Housing Coalition's website. I brought the most recent report with me, which is the 2020-2021 report. And so we have 18 years of good baseline data on affordable housing in Louisville. And what it does on a yearly basis is it looks at at an issue that is important in that time frame. So it has a focus topic. Last year's, the one that you're being handed out right now, was looking at the impact of health and housing, and particularly looking at the COVID pandemic on housing stability in Louisville. And so we have, this year when we publish, we'll publish in June of 2022. We'll have 19 good years of good data on housing and affordable housing and fair housing in Louisville. And what it does is it looks at this data. There are usually 9 measures of housing affordability, and it comes up with policy recommendations. So if you're talking to anybody that makes policy on housing in Louisville, they're looking at this document. This provides the data. This also provides the data for housing, nonprofit developers, for the legal aid, for a lot of different organizations that do, the Louisville Urban League, who do affordable housing work and advocacy. This is what they use when they write grant documents as well, to give the baseline data so that they can work on the issues. And so I wanted to bring that with me today so everybody had a copy of that. And like I said, all the State of Metropolitan Housing reports are online on our website, and you can access those there digitally. So just looking at comparative data, so what I did was pull 2010, and I pulled, 2010 and 2020 is what I did, so we can see kind of a comparable kind of set of maps by demographics, by where public housing is located, where subsidized housing is located in Louisville. And I would urge you to think back to that history that exists and how it has impacted what these maps look like today. And this first set of maps is actually 3 maps, because we have a map, thanks to another report we did on fair housing, from 1960 about where the African American, where the black population lives in Louisville. And you see the darker the map, the more concentrated the areas are as far as residents living in those areas. So on the left you have 1960, in the middle you have 2010, and on the right you have 2020 data, which is actually 2019 data, so for the 2020 report. And as you can see, those areas of concentration are pretty much the same as from 70 years ago. And that is a lasting legacy of a lot of these housing policies that we had, where homeownership was denied. There was not, mortgages were not extended to people, to black households. And I think you'll see kind of a theme develop here too. It's because I would think about this in areas of concentration, because you're going to see in each of these maps a very similar thing that you're going to see develop. This next map is the Hispanic Latino population in Louisville, mostly south of the airport, maybe a little bit to the east of the airport. And you can see that in 2010 on the left and 2020 on the right. So not much movement there as well. Populations are still concentrated in those areas. The next one, I have a series of a lot of maps here. And I would urge you, a lot of it, mostly the 2020 are going to be in this report, but you can get online and see kind of year by year if you want to. The next one is a population of female-headed households with children who are less than 18 years of age. So yet again, you can see the concentrated areas are West Louisville and just east of the airport for the most part. Not much movement there as well. Also, concentrations of poverty. That is definitely a result of a lot of housing policies over the year. A primary tool for people to build individual and family wealth is through homeownership. And as you can see here, West Louisville, south of the airport, kind of southwest, and then a little bit east. And you can see the overlay of these areas of concentrations of each of these demographics is the same. And just thinking about poverty, the darker areas are the most impoverished. They have the lowest home values, they have the worst health outcomes, the lowest vaccination rates, if you want to take it to a pandemic world that we live in today, the least access to food markets, quality food, and the list really goes on and on when you think about these areas where these concentrations occur. Another area is people with individuals with a disability. You can see this is the 2020 map here. Again, West Louisville and Southwest Louisville. So you're talking about health outcomes, access to health care, and the like. And I'm going to have mostly 2020 maps here. There are sometimes we don't have comparative maps for each year. But thinking about subsidized public housing, seeing where the concentration of that is, kind of the downtown metro area, the urban core as they call it, and West Louisville. You also can look at housing vouchers, so Section 8 housing vouchers, where those are largely concentrated. And again, you can see just east of the airport and in West Louisville. And this last one I think is interesting as well, because this kind of brings it together about where you live matters. Your zip code matters. People in West Louisville, you can see in the kind of the yellow, or well, it's supposed to be yellow, it's kind of white, on the West Louisville area have the least life expectancy of about 70 to 72 years of age. And as we go east, we see that increase to where it's almost 13 years more for individuals who live in East Louisville. So if you go back and look at those maps of areas of concentration, you can see kind of how that impacts life expectancy overall. 13 years difference of somebody living in West Louisville as opposed to East Louisville. We'll also look a little bit here about housing tenure. So what they mean by housing tenure is who owns a home, who rents a home, and we break this down by total households, and then we look at white households, black households, Latino households, and then by kind of family households, so looking at male-headed households with young children, female-headed households with young children, and married couples as well. And just to kind of contextualize this a little bit before we look at the exact numbers, is that Jefferson County has 21% of the occupied rental housing in all of Kentucky. It also has, this was pre-pandemic, 67% of Kentucky's evictions, 67% of Kentucky's total evictions across the state. Also, it has 42% of Kentucky's black population. And you can go back to look at the charts by demographics, and you can see the outcomes of this and kind of what that history looks like in the current maps. But if you look at home ownership across Louisville, white households have a home ownership rate of 71%. Black households have a home ownership rate of 36%, so almost twice as much. And this is really what grew out of, I know you're looking at the Path Forward document from the Urban League, and one of the bullets in there that they're working on is the 22,000, or the need for 22,000 more home ownership opportunities for black households. And this is where this comes from, is from this report here. We did a report in 2019 that was called 22,000 Equities. And so it was looking at building wealth and the lack of wealth in certain communities. And how do we close that gap of 22,000 households to create some kind of equity in the home ownership world. So if you're looking at this, you can look at the opposite of that too. You can look at the number of renters, right? So if you're looking at black households, you're seeing about 63%, 64% of households rent, as opposed to about 29% of white households. And the same goes for Hispanic households as well. But if you go down to female households that have young children, there is also a deficit of owners. There's only a 43% rate of home ownership there, as compared to an 82% of married households across Louisville, Jefferson County. And so this all goes to that part of that conversation on creating equity in home ownership and building wealth across the community, trying to combat those areas of concentration of poverty across the city. And I know it's hard to see these numbers, and I apologize, but like I said, I will send the PowerPoint out to Susan so that she can pass it along to everybody to look at, and then you'll have access to the full reports too. Talking about homeowners versus renters, this is kind of a very, I think, it grabbed my attention when we saw it for the first time. So you can look at census tracts in Louisville, how population, how the census is taken. You can look at census blocks, census tracts, different kind of levels of geographic definition. And so if you look at this, you think about home ownership versus renters, 50% of black homeowners in Louisville live in just 22 of the 198 census tracts across all of Louisville. And you can see those concentrations yet again mirror any map you want to pick of what I showed you earlier today or any other map that's actually in the report. And that's kind of amazing to me. It shows east of the airport, West Louisville, and then there's a concentration out in the very east end. And I'm not sure what census block that is, or census tract that is. But yeah, yet again, concentrations of areas. Also thinking about homeowners versus renters, we always say the best way to have affordable housing is have a mandated better wage. So when you look at wages, this is actually from 2017, so it's a couple years old, and we haven't replicated it, but I would, if I were a betting man, I would say it hasn't changed that much in a 3-year period. But if you look at this going from left to right, again, if you look at the housing wage for a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, so looking at not only the rent, but looking at the utilities that go into affordability, a wage of $15.79, and the total number of jobs in Louisville that meet that pay median less than that, actually pay less than $15.79. 254,000 jobs in Louisville pay less than $15.79 an hour. And so that's 40% of the workforce that cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. 40%. And if you go up to a 3-bedroom apartment, which is the third column, it's paying a wage of $21.52, and almost 400,000 jobs do not pay that in Louisville. So 62% of Louisvillians cannot afford a 3-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. So that's pretty always decisive to me to look at that number and say, wow, it's a lot of people. So I want to move a little bit away from these areas of concentration, talking about wages, to looking a little bit about other issues. MHC has been involved for many years in utility work as well, because utility work and evictions has been another areas that we really looked at, but utilities in particularly. And this is a map looking at LG&E customers eligible for disconnections across all Louisville by zip code, I do believe. And you can see the areas of concentration again. So the map on the left is 2019. The map on the right is 2020. We hope to reproduce this again in the 2022 report to show, yet again, the areas are concentrated where disconnections are possible in Louisville. And we get this data. MHC is involved in rate cases as an intervener for low-income households at the Public Service Commission. So if there's a rate case or any case before the Public Service Commission, MHC is there to represent Louisville's low-income households, and we're represented by Tom Fitzgerald at the Kentucky Resources Council in that work, and have been represented by him for many years. And so we get this data, so you're able to do data requests for these cases. So you ask questions, you ask for different types of data, and so that's where this data haul comes from. They're not very forthright with their data most of the time. So if we're an intervener, we can access that data, and that's allowing us to produce these maps to show where the impacted areas are. I'll be intrigued to see what the 2021 map looks like, as well as we've had utility assistance programs as well. Also, evictions was another area that we do a lot of work in. There's been an eviction crisis during the pandemic. It's grown and become even worse. It's been magnified, I think, in a large extent for people in Louisville because of the coverage of the pandemic, people recognizing People are being kicked out of their homes, either legally or illegally through an eviction process. But there was an eviction crisis prior to the pandemic. Let's look at that as well. We went to one eviction court hearing prior to the pandemic. 93 cases were heard in 30 minutes. That was pretty common practice. I haven't attended an online eviction case. We have had a lot of colleagues who have done that since they went virtually. And I think the process is just as bad. We made some gains as far as rental assistance being made available. And you can see that in this chart. Again, the numbers are small, but you can see a great decrease to where we were in 2018 and 2019. We were at 14 or 15% of total annual evictions, eviction filing rate of 14 or 15% in Louisville. So that's looking at a census tract, how many people in that census tract, and then how many eviction cases are filed in each of those eviction court. And so we were at 14 or 15% consistently, which was much higher than the national average. You can see in 2020 on here, the eviction filing rate was 5.42%. So anybody who says that rental assistance programs don't work in Louisville, you can see the numbers. They do afford people to stay in their homes. Does it bring it to zero? No. Do we want it to be zero? Yes. Does there need to be reform in eviction court? That is definitely a yes. Because what you see there when you attend is landlords, property owners who have attorneys who are required to attend. And you, for the most part, see tenants who are either not present, which accounts for going through 93 cases in 30 minutes, or if they are there, not represented, and then not being granted a trial by jury or a jury trial to show evidence. They can't show the evidence to the court. And we've even heard judges in court say, we will not hear that evidence, and then deny a jury hearing as well, so you can't hear that evidence. So evictions, there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. And this last eviction map here is the post-moratorium eviction filings in Louisville. So this is post-March 2020. And you can see concentrations, is why I wanted to show this yet again, is where the evictions are occurring, where they're being filed. It's West Louisville, it's Southwest Louisville as well, as more of the concentrated areas. So this is a huge issue. There's been a group of housing advocates, a group of direct service providers, government officials, a very kind of diverse group of housing navigators who have been meeting on a weekly basis at first, and now every 2 weeks we are meeting to talk about rental assistance issues, eviction court, any kind of issue that comes around those issues. And that came about because of the pandemic. So I think a positive thing, if there was anything positive that came out of the pandemic or continuing pandemic, is that this group of people was talking. We were talking to each other kind of separately, but we do it on a weekly or every other week basis now. So all these groups are having this conversation and following what is actually going on, and then reacting and trying to make changes throughout. And I think we've seen a lot of changes, positive changes in eviction court, to where you have a representative of Metro Council there who is participating in the rental assistance program. That's made an impact. But there's also the reality that when new judges are elected, a lot of these aren't policies that have been implemented. They've been implemented by the judge as processes. And so that's a big issue as well. Where are we going to go when there are a new slate of judges in eviction court? So there's a lot of work to be done in evictions. I would invite you to be a part of that work. At the local level, at the state level, half the battle is accessing data on evictions from the administrative office of the courts. Not an easy task, and not an easy task to access a phone number for people who have eviction cases filed against them. There's a group actively working at the Coalition of the Homeless who reaches out to people who have eviction filings against them to let them know, make sure they know they have an eviction filing against them, when their court date is, and then that there are programs that might be able to help them have a legal representative there by their side when they're facing this difficult situation. And so I'll talk a little bit more about policies and some legislation that is actually being considered at the state level, at the local level, some successes we've had at the local level here in a few minutes. And this is where my friend George Eklund was going to talk tonight on homelessness from the Coalition of the Homelessness. We wanted to show homelessness by the numbers. So if I stumble a little bit through this, I apologize, but I will try. He gave me some notes to give some talking points. But there were 1,013 homeless folks in Jefferson County. And this is from the census that they do on this point in time study they do every year. 257 were sleeping outside, 756 were sheltered, 168 were under the age of 18, so you're looking at more than 10% of homeless are people or kids under 18. 380 were female, 630 were males, 481 were white, and 455 were black, and this is from the survey. Some people didn't answer ethnicity as well or race. And then 292 of those who were counted were chronically homeless. And so those are just some stark numbers there. And when we talk about homelessness, we often think about those who are sleeping on the street, right? This is really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the issue of homelessness and housing insecurity, because these are interrelated topics, because housing is the issue we need to solve, one of the big issues when it comes to homelessness. These are people that are the most visible and dire because they have been failed at multiple levels and at multiple times. The biggest and easiest thing we can do to support these individuals is to remember that we're talking about people here, not just numbers. It's people, and acknowledging that their presence, either with a wave or that they are human beings. And you get into conversations about giving a donation. Panhandling comes up inevitably when you have these conversations, and that's a personal choice for people to give or not to give. There are services that you can definitely inform people about that exist, but there are many needs and areas of care that are required in many instances, and there are those mechanisms that are in place. Sorry, I'm reading through his notes here. He sent them to me right before I came here. This is one night. So the point in time count is a one night across the county where people get some accounting of the total number of people sleeping on the street and sleeping in shelters. And this is far from a perfect number, George says. He says he does not account for the number of people doubling up with friends or families. It does not account for an entire year of people that enter and exit the system. It's only a snapshot is what it provides. And when people sleep outside, they seek safety and privacy. There are many people who don't get counted because they sleep in a car or their camps are very well hidden. So people are missed as they are in the system itself. Here's a graph that George wanted me to share. Everybody's journey to homelessness is different. There are factors like mental illness, incarceration, substance use disorders are all contributing factors, but are not root cause of the issue. The lack of affordable housing and competitive wages are the root cause of homelessness. Mental illness, abuse, high bills, substance use exist in every zip code in our county. The difference is that people in some zip codes have access to savings, wealth, resources, and are able to navigate a lot of these obstacles. They have support networks as well. And those who are at the poverty line don't have an option in many cases. And so those are the most visible of homeless people that you see. He also wanted to share this. Again, it's rather small. But homelessness has always fluctuated during economic downturns and war. You think about Hoovervilles from your history books. And what we think about homelessness today is a modern issue. Reagan and Nixon years effectively defunded support that kept people in houses. It vilified the poor in many respects and established the idea of a worthy poor. If we funded HUD's budget at pre-1970s levels, we would be spending $500 billion each year to combat housing instability. $500 billion. In 2017, we spent more on the home interest tax deduction than we did on HUD, subsidizing homeownerships at the expense of people who are very low income levels in the end. So that's some of the homelessness data that we have. And like I said, George is more than happy to come out and talk homelessness with you in more detail and more depth. The next thing I really wanted to get into and kind of mentioned earlier is we'll talk about the Land Development Code. So look at this map. The yellow area is the area that is zoned for single-family housing as compared to multifamily housing, so apartment complexes and whatnot. 75% of the land in Jefferson County is zoned for single-family housing. And so this is why the Land Development Code is so important. And we're going to talk about that because this is a big issue coming up with Metro Council ordered a equity review of the Land Development Code back in 2019, I think now, maybe 2020. There are 3 phases of that are currently going on. And this is important because Louisville passed Plan 2040, which is the comprehensive plan for Louisville. So it basically is a 20-year plan for the built environment in Louisville. And so every 20 years they do one of these studies. And for the first time ever in Plan 2040, the words actually fair and affordable housing were actually mentioned in Plan 2040. That's been a long time battle. My predecessor, one of my predecessors, Kathy Hinko, who was former executive director, worked on this issue for decades. Held lots of public meetings during the comprehensive plan process. And so actually the words, and they're actually actions that need to be taken for fair and affordable housing. And so we need, the next step to that is instilling the spirit of Plan 2040 in the Land Development Code itself. So the Land Development Code is the regulatory document that tells you what can be built and where it can be built, where people can live, where people can't live. And that is why this is so important, because it sets up the conversation for how to combat the affordable housing issue in Louisville that we face. And so with Land Development Code reform, phase 1 has already occurred. That happened 2020, 2021. One of the big things that came out of that was the passage of accessory dwelling units by right, so people can add a granny flat to the back of their home if they want a relative to move in. That was one of the big issues that was combated in phase 1, and it passed. I think 3 council members voted against it, so 23 voted in favor of it. It had quite a bit of support, and I think what I would say is that going from phase 1 to phase 3, the complexity gets even more so, but so does the controversy about some of the issues. So by the time you get to phase 3, you're talking inclusionary zoning, where affordable housing is mandated in all parts of Louisville. And that will be controversial in many respects in many parts of Louisville. And so the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, through a grant from the Humana Foundation, is working on equity and the Land Development Code. So we have a nonprofit working through one of the large foundations in Louisville, saying that Land Development Code is important, and that's important because we get back to that map that I showed earlier about life expectancy in Louisville, right? So, housing, I see housing as this keystone issue across Louisville. So if you have more housing stability, people are stable in their homes, they have better access to jobs, better access to transit, better access to quality food, health care. I mean, the list goes on and on. Educational outcomes improve and the like. And so, with this reform effort, going into phase 2, the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, through this grant, has developed an initiative called the Attainable Housing for All. We call it the AHA initiative to have a little fun with it. But we're looking at Louisville's opportunity for housing choice. So opportunity and choice are words you will hear a lot of times when you're talking about affordable housing. We're talking about people having access to fair and affordable housing across Louisville. And so we're moving into phase 2, and we wanted to really change the conversation. Let's talk about attainable housing. Let's talk about attainable housing for economic development. Let's talk about it as a tool to bring about better health outcomes. We are the organization, that MHC is the organization working with the Center for Health Equity on their Healthy Louisville initiative, Plan 2025, I think. And we're working on the housing pillar of that, so thinking about social determinants of health. Housing is an important part of that conversation. And so when we're talking about attainable housing for all, we kind of came up with 3 buckets that we're going to be talking about in phase 2, and I think it will, to a certain degree, probably carry on to phase 3 as well. But the 3 buckets we're talking about are to increase housing choice by allowing affordable housing to be constructed in all parts of the city, hoping to further desegregate Louisville, to increase the production of affordable housing, and to increase the production of diverse types of housing to meet the needs of a diverse and growing population. So these are the buckets that we've dropped phase 2 in. So when you're talking about this creation, there are a lot of reforms that are being considered that are a part of this. And I've listed those up here, and we talk about decreasing residential segregation and increasing housing choice by allowing affordable housing to be constructed in all parts of Louisville. The spirit of Plan 2040 commits to that. Metro Council is committed to that in a resolution as well. You're talking about deed restrictions and covenants. You're talking about increased density and decreased minimum lot sizes, identifying areas appropriate for higher density for residential uses, which kind of bleeds over into phase 3 a little bit, and capacity standards for development. If you're talking about the increase in production of affordable housing, is what MHC works for and has worked for over 30 years, is incentivizing desirable development types. And that's something, if you look at Greater Louisville Inc., the Chamber for Louisville, they're talking about increased density as well. That's GLI and MHC aren't always on the same page, but there are definitely areas like that we can work together on. And I think that's a positive, especially when they include that in their local agenda for 2022. They're talking about incentive-driven programs. We'll talk about an example here in a minute. They're talking about increased density as well. And then that's when you get into the increased production of affordable housing, you get into phase 3, and you start talking about inclusionary zoning as one of the issues that we need to talk about. And also increasing this is where a lot of the conversation has taken place so far, is to increase the production of diverse housing types to meet the needs of diverse and growing population. So we're talking about multiplex housing units, courtyards, pocket neighborhoods, duplexes, tiny houses come up in that conversation as well. And you'll see this picture a lot. Planning and Design uses this. This was part of their study they did when they were first looking at land development code reform. And it's so-called the missing middle housing. So all of those types of housing I mentioned, duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard. There's just a variety, triplexes, pocket neighborhoods, and things like that. So what the land development code reform does is that I think what it really does is create a policy environment to be able to build and access more attainable housing units across Louisville. It's about housing opportunity for people, where can they find a place to live, an affordable place to live, but also a housing choice, where do they want to live, and that needs to be in all parts of Louisville. So I'm going to attempt to show 2 videos here. I'm not sure how this will work with this, so I might need John. Do I just hit the... I may need to go back here. We're going to see 2 videos. The first is a video from Adam Hall, who is the board chair for the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. He works at Fifth Third Bank. He's the vice president there. And Adam's been involved for many, many years with MHC and with affordable housing. So you want to hear kind of his voice on attainable housing for all.
Many of the challenges that we face as a community stem from the fact that we have such high levels of housing instability and insecurity, and what's best for Louisville, Kentucky in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. Without attainable housing for all, Louisville will continue to fall behind our peer cities. We used to benchmark ourselves against Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Nashville, Atlanta. All of those cities are significantly bigger and more vibrant than Louisville is. And so we've got to think about ways that we can make us an attractive place for people to want to be, and for people who are growing up here to want to stay here, because there is a brain drain, and we are losing talent. First of all, obviously it can impact our employees, and so if our employees aren't stably housed, then they're not going to be bringing their best self to work, which is going to impact our business outcomes. To think about police officers, firemen, teachers, to park at your grocery store. There are lots of people in our community who are spending more than half of their income on their housing. So when you think about the trade-offs that that makes for people, food insecurity, healthcare, all of those sorts of things where people are having to choose, do I keep a roof over my head or do I eat? And so I think that we really have to be sensitive to what are we missing because we have a system in place that really creates these inequities. All of those things are really important and would not be at the forefront of people's attention were it not for the great work that Metropolitan Housing Coalition is doing.
And then our second video is from Rashan Martin, who is the new executive director at St. John Center. So I wanted to play a clip from here. There's a whole series, and you can get that on the Metropolitan Housing Coalition's website. There's a page dedicated to attainable housing for all. I'll spare you the one with me since you have to listen to me this evening. So here's a video of Rashan.
Land development code reform matters because where you live matters, and we need more attainable housing options across the city. The issues, right, they do hit close to home because even for me, right, I'm somebody who has a large student loan debt, I'm somebody who is affected by the rising cost of property taxes and utility bills are wild. All of our expenses are going up, and so when I even think about my future and my ability to maintain, right, my housing situation or to improve it, the possibility seems very grim. But as much as I know that it affects me, I know that there is a whole group of people who are affected in a much worse way. So if you think about a single mother, if she's paying the majority of her expenses to keep shelter over her family's head, what resources does she have left to pay for childcare? How is she to show up for her child and make sure that they're getting the support that they need in school, especially when we're utilizing all these virtual options? People need options that are close to where they work. They need options that look different than single-family residential homes. We need more apartments. We need duplexes, multiplexes, courtyard buildings, right? We have to start to innovate the type of housing that we create, but we can't do that because of the restrictions. And when we talk about affordable, attainable housing, that is a basic necessity. Housing is a right, and it's a healthcare issue, it's an education issue, it's a human rights issue. To Metro Council, I would say that with the American Rescue Plan, with that funding, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to expand housing options across the city. But the funding alone is not enough. In order to fix the housing crisis, we have to reform the land development codes.
Kept wanting to replay it. But yeah, there's a series of videos from very different perspectives, and part of this initiative is to grow that coalition of voices for land development code reform, to grow the opportunities for affordable housing. And I'll show you a couple more that we did some infographics with. And who you have here is Christy McCravey, who's the executive director of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Says successful communities are those that understand that the entire community thrives when basic needs are met. Affordable housing is the cornerstone of meeting these basic needs. By addressing the housing needs of our community now, we establish a path of stability and continuity for generations to come. And these are all people you can contact, get involved with, have conversation with about this. And I wanted to kind of paint a broad spectrum of folks. And this is Rebecca Hollenbach from the Center for Health Equity. Housing is a critical root cause of health. Improving access to safe, affordable housing protects families and leads to better mental and physical health outcomes, making Louisville a healthier and safer community. Also have Deanna Karam from she's CEO of the Jeffersontown Chamber of Commerce. Affordable housing is a necessary asset our community must have to attract talent and support a healthy and thriving workforce. Our greater Louisville economy is built on manufacturing, distribution, and service-related jobs. We must encourage and expand housing options for hard-working folks making a living in the economy's thriving industries. And then she's Celine Mutia Maria, is an MHC board member, but she is a policy strategist at the Louisville Urban League. Phenomenal person, phenomenal housing advocate. One thing we all have in common is that our days begin and end at home. Quality, affordable housing is the foundation for healthy communities where people can learn, work, play, and thrive. These are basic opportunities that we must ensure for every citizen. And so just a broad swath of individuals looking at affordable housing and the need from a variety of perspectives. Bankers, nonprofit affordable housing advocates, leaders of the Chamber of Commerce in Jeffersontown, or the Affordable Housing Trust Fund lead, Center for Health Equity, a broad swath of the community looking at these issues. And one more, put me up there. Housing is the keystone to better living. If we can give someone stable housing, it opens us up to opportunity for better jobs, healthcare, education, and so much more. And that's really what the Land Development Code Initiative is about opening up opportunity and choice. Am I doing good all the time? Okay. And Susan had asked me to do some actionable items. And so there are a lot of initiatives at the local level, at the state level. You can imagine with the state legislature in session, there's always something going on. We've seen a lot more housing and homelessness bills proposed this year. Many have not been fully discussed or vetted or moved through the process, but hopefully setting up a future conversation. But this first slide is about the local level, what you can do at Louisville Metro government by contacting your council members, by contacting all of council, the representatives, and the mayor himself. So Land Development Code reform is, of course, the first thing I list up here. And I wanted to draw your attention. There's three pieces of legislation right now before Metro Council. Two of them are to propose a moratorium on what is known as mixed residential development incentives. So an incentive-based program like the GLIs of the world, developers love incentive-based programs where you get points. It would be some MRDI, you will hear that term rather than mixed residential development incentives. So MRDI, basically what it does is create a development with both single-family housing and multifamily housing that is a mixed income development. And you get points for including affordable housing, for including multifamily housing, preserving tree canopy. There's a lot of different things. Distance to a TARC drop-off, distance to a park. You build points on this. And what it does is it dedicates a certain percentage of affordable housing into that development. And so the important thing is that's a tool that's already in the Land Development Code. It is a unique tool in the Land Development Code that exists now. And when we're in the midst of an equity review of the Land Development Code, MHC, our coalition and partners, don't believe it is a good thing to move forward on to remove an equity tool for fair and affordable housing out of the Land Development Code, to place a moratorium on that. There are 2 projects, now 3 projects that have been proposed and going through the process. This would stop that development, those 3 developments, from moving forward while the moratorium continued. And they want to review the code itself. It was passed in 2015. My predecessor, Kathy Hinko, was involved in it. A few members of council were actually there and involved in those conversations as well. So that's a piece of legislation. Went to planning and zoning. The review was voted down in committee. It goes to Metro Council this coming Thursday for a full vote. MHC and our partners would definitely urge you to get involved in that, to oppose this legislation, because it threatens. So what if they do build in more complexities to MRDI than is currently in there? Developers won't use the tool, and affordable and attainable housing won't be built. So nobody wins in the end on that. There's also a resolution on reviewing accessory dwelling units by right and requiring notifications. I think it's mostly targeted towards HOAs, so that accessory dwelling units aren't built in backyards, but there are already tools that have not been addressed at this point to where HOA agreements and whatnot can prevent that from happening already. So why review this, the accessory dwelling units, which was part of passage of the first phase of land development code reform? Why require this when we just had this conversation 2 years ago? There's also a right to counsel. We were the first southern city in the United States to pass a right to counsel law where families with children who make less than 125% of the federal poverty limit have access to counsel in eviction court. So they did a pilot project with $400,000 through legal aid. This has been used quite widely. 48% of their cases load in eviction court have received aid through this program so far. So they're looking to renew that, to expand it, to embed it in the actual metro budget rather than through federal funding that has come through over the last few years, and create this as an opportunity for more families as well. There's also a rental registry. If you own a property, you're supposed to register with the city. There's no enforcement mechanism behind that. If you don't do it, you don't do it. You can't access any of that data. We've tried to access data. It's been scraped every time we've requested the data. No identifiable people, businesses, or anything, addresses. So there's a lot of conversations about accessibility and transparency on rental registry. Also expanding funding for, and actually giving funding to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund for building affordable housing. They normally receive about $10 million a year. They received $40 million through the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA dollars, all dedicated to 30% and below AMI developments of units in that area, but that's not enough. I mean, there's a need, like I said earlier, for 31,412 units at 30% and below AMI, 55% under 50% AMI. If we keep throwing $10 million, even if they leverage that for an additional $13 or $17 every year, when this study was done in 2019, the housing needs assessment, the 31,000 units needed was projected to cost $3.4 billion alone. In 2022, that number has already exceeded $5 billion in need, and the need has only grown based on that number in the last 3 years. So those are some numbers there that are quite stark when you look at the need for funding to do that. And so $10 million a year, yes, it's great, but it needs to be more than that. And then looking at renter representation on Louisville Metro boards and commissions. We've done a kind of a cursory look through PVA records and deeds that are on file, looking at 7 different commissions and boards for Louisville Metro. Over 90% of the people who are on those boards and commissions are homeowners. I think it was 94%, so 6% were basically unknown because it was hard to determine. You can say maybe they are renters, but there were 6% that was really unknown. So what we're saying is that people are making policy decisions. You need to have renters as part of that discussion at the table when they're making discussion on housing in Louisville. So those are just some of the few issues at Louisville Metro Council that are housing related that are being discussed at this point. There's a lot more. There'll be more during the upcoming budget discussion. And this for sure you cannot see. If you can, you get extra points. But this is looking at the 2022 Kentucky General Assembly. And George listed 6 bills here in the House. Improving ID accessibility, House Bill 197. It's actually one of the few bills on housing and homelessness that has moved forward. It's passed out of committee. It's supposed to go for a vote before the full House. It was supposed to be on Friday, but that didn't happen. They adjourned before they did it. And what it does is give homeless folks access to an ID. And you need an ID to access so many services, so many different things in life. And so being able to access this as 18-year or younger if you're homelessness, or anybody else that is homelessness and does not have an address. So that's actually gaining some traction and is getting bipartisan support. Another one is House Bill 86. They established a state affordable housing tax credit. That was one that was backed by industry folks, builders, developers, affordable housing advocates, across the board. It seemed to be getting support from a bipartisan group, but it's not really moved that much at all. The State Affordable Housing Coalition thought they had made a lot of headway on this, but it was introduced. We'll see if it makes any movement here at the end of this session. If not, hopefully next year it's building some momentum for that. The eviction expungement, there's House Bill 159 to where if you're evicted, that record gets expunged, and it can't be. So that's part of the thing. If you have an eviction filed against you, let alone having an eviction actually a judgment against you, it makes it almost impossible to rent a home. You can't move on. That former landlord owns you for so long because you can't find another landlord who's going to rent to you. So expunging the record, basically sealing the record, is very important to let people move on. Somebody may have had a crisis in their life and to find stability, get back on their feet. And so that's an important one that's been introduced this year. There's also an Eviction Set Out Reform having to do with property for tenants who have been set out. And it basically details what responsibilities the landlord has as far as the property that remains. And then two others. There's a rent control ordinance, House Bill 131, and it basically delegates to municipalities like Louisville or Lexington the ability to establish rent control in development districts. This was proposed by Representative Attica Scott, and I think it's mostly geared towards the West End Opportunity Partnership, out of the fear of displacement of renters in those areas, in those neighborhoods. And so that's not had a hearing at all, but it has been introduced here. And there's another one that is for basically an update of the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act, which defines the relationship between landlords and tenants. And it's basically an update from what is 1970s URALTA to maybe 2000. I won't say 2022, but maybe we'll get to 2000 where there's a little bit more of a equitable relationship between the two groups. So that's a bill before the state as well. And then I wanted to give you a list of resources, and like I said, I'll provide the slideshow. But some books that have come up and been popular over the last several years: The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, looking at redlining at the national level. Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We actually had him here last year as our annual meeting speaker. Not physically here, he was virtually here. And he gave a really good talk. If you haven't read Evicted, it's a study of evictions in Milwaukee. But it's pretty heart-wrenching and gets to the key issues surrounding evictions. Race for Profit, Kianga Yamata Taylor was here at the University of Louisville a few years ago. I think she's actually been here twice, maybe with the Ann Braden Institute as well, talking about that relationship with housing and lending and banks. And then the address book is one I read recently, Deidre Mask, who looks at the importance and how addresses are allocated across the world, and even kind of a very radical thought about assigning IDs to homeless people using vacant property addresses. It's an interesting read in kind of an international kind of context, so just something to look at. And then I listed several reports. So our State of Metropolitan Housing Report, it's all available online. We also, the last three impediments of fair housing choice in Louisville is a required document that's created. MHC has created it 2010, 2015, and 2020. That is also on our website. The Housing Needs Assessment, which I've talked a lot about, is either on the Affordable Housing Trust website or the city's website. The city's I think both of them have, I know both of them have the market area additions or addendums to that as well, which is very helpful when you're looking at areas. The Health Equity Report 2017 is the most recent. 2022, I think, is going to be the update. It's supposed to be out this year. I know they're working on it. I just talked to them the other day. So that'll be another great report to look at. And then they also did, the Center for Health Equity did a health impact assessment for Kentucky's affordable housing tax credit, which is one of the pieces of legislation that is being considered at the state level. So I'm going to stop there just to reiterate that I think one of the things that's important to me in this work is thinking about where do you start your day and where do you end your day, and hopefully that's under a roof. That drives a lot of people who do this work, and what we try to do on a daily basis to make it a better world so people can have access to a home, fair affordability, accessibility to attainable housing. And so if we can affect good change, positive change in this area and of the affordable housing and housing stability in Louisville, it impacts, like I said, so many other areas: health access, access to educational outcomes, access to education and educational outcomes, and so many other things. So thank you for listening. I would love to take some questions if you have them, or if I can't answer a question, I would love to get back to you with an answer, because I will be first to admit I don't know everything, but I will. I'm a historian by trade. I know where to look, and I'll find it out for you. So thanks for coming this evening.
Do we have any questions from the floor for Tony? Tony, if you can repeat them into the mic when people ask them.
Okay. Go ahead.
You mentioned something about, on the actionable list of things that we can do, about a meeting coming up that needs support on a certain thing they're considering, and I didn't put the notes down.
So before Metro, so she's asking about an actionable, it's a resolution and an ordinance before Metro Council. The ordinance has been tabled for now because it was about the moratorium on mixed residential development incentives, MRDI. There is the next meeting of Metro Council is this coming Thursday, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. Hey, I could count to 10 now, I can count to 17. They were making me count to 10 earlier to check the mic. But they will hear MRDI. It's being forwarded to the full Metro Council with a negative recommendation, but it still has to undergo another vote at the, well, that's interesting. Oh, train. I grew up next to a train back home in Ashland, so I should know that. But they will hold that. It's on the agenda. They will hold a vote on that. We're hoping that it continues to be opposed by Metro Council because we think if they open up that law, so what I would urge you to do is contact your council member, have your voice heard. MHC has a mailing list we're kind of keeping people up to date on. That was proposed by Councilman Piagentini. And then if the review this is the review that they have to vote on, and if that gets voted down, the possibility that they move forward with a moratorium piece of legislation is probably not going to happen. So I would urge you to write or call your council member. Yes, sir.
You spent quite a bit of time talking about evictions and the need for more representation and evidence. And does that mean that there's an assumption that there's a lot of abuse or unjust evictions?
Yeah, so you can look at it. So there is an eviction process, right? It goes through the court system. A case has to be, a forcible detainer needs to be filed. And so there's a process. That court process doesn't always apply to the tenants. I mean, the case gets called, right? They don't have representation. They ask for a jury trial. They mostly get denied because that takes time, and you can't do 93 cases in 30 minutes. That has even been, the caseload has been even more than that. There are cases as well, it's been reported on in the news, where landlords will, screw the door shut, not give tenants access because they haven't paid their rent. It's called an informal eviction is what they say. That's illegal. That's very illegal. That's why they have an eviction process. And if that occurs, there are ways in which you can challenge that. But yes, there are illegal evictions that occur routinely here in Louisville. Tenants, for the most part, don't know what to do when that occurs. That's why it's nice to have a legal aid society that represents low-income households who mostly face the evictions. And yeah, so there's that illegal process. And you think about it from this respect too. Even illegal or illegal, a person's livelihood is taken away as far as family photos, diplomas. You have to have certain documents to be able to apply for different types of programs, federal programs, state programs. If you don't have your legal documents to be able to do that, if they're in your apartment, you don't have access to them, and they've been put on a curbside and it's been picked through by whoever walked by, this is a result of legal and illegal evictions. And so those do occur. People don't know what to do most of the time. People need to know that there are organizations like Legal Aid, the Urban League, many other that can provide advice on how to deal with that. So that answer your question?
It is.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Susan?
I recall about a year ago listening to Sadiqa Reynolds talk about the Urban League having rental assistance money available, but a number of landlords refusing to accept it because they were giving them a 1099 when they gave the landlord the money, and the landlord did not want the 1099. Wonder why? But anyway, is that a rare occurrence, or is that a systemic problem?
It's a problem, big time. We early on, so when rental assistance was giving, it had at the beginning it had to be applied for by the landlord to go through the process, and the tenant had to inform the landlord that the process was occurring, and so there was all this paperwork that was required. At a certain point, and I can't remember when it occurred, there was all sort of a kind of a dam broke, and landlords were saying, "I'm not accepting rental assistance. I don't want to give you my 1099." I mean, my mind automatically goes to why they're not giving that 1099, and there's a lot of under the table cash dealing going on. But this is also illegal. I mean, Louisville passed, they expanded the fair housing protected classes in Louisville. One of those is source of income. Source of income covers Section 8. You can still drive. I live in South Louisville down there at Iroquois Park, and you can still drive around and see for rent signs, no Section 8 accepted. That's illegal. But when it comes to this, we're having discussions at the moment with legal aids, drawing up a memo on this. Hopefully we'll see some court cases on this, but denying rental assistance is a denial of a source of income. It's discrimination based on source of income. Even though now there are more renters that are being paid directly when the landlord denies accepting rental assistance or denies to be part of the process, they've made that switch over time. But it's illegal. You can't discriminate based on source of income, and that rental assistance is a source of income, especially if you're paying it to the renter, right? And then they try to pay the rent, and it's still denied. So I would say stay tuned on that. It's a problem. And the law in Louisville that expanded protected classes says that's illegal. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to advise anybody, but I will say what the law says. Does that answer your question, Susan? Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
How does the city go after these landlords that are doing illegal things?
As far as?
Well, do they get arrested or fined? I think it sounds like no.
In many cases, no. There have been cases. So when you're discriminated against any kind of housing source of income, based on race, based on ethnicity, whatever. If you have housing discrimination, in discrimination of any kind, you can contact the Louisville Metro Housing Human Relations Commission. There's also a state organization. There's also what is called the Lexington Fair Housing Council, but it actually covers Louisville as well. They should just be called the Fair Housing Council because they do statewide stuff, not just Lexington. But it gets reported to them, and they sometimes file lawsuits against the landlord. Sometimes they call directly the landlord and have a conversation with them. Sometimes that resolves the case when it's especially with the source of income being so new, there really hasn't been much legal challenge to that yet. I think there will be. But I think even they say, having a discussion sometimes with a landlord who doesn't know that source of income is discriminating based on source of income, or saying, no, I don't accept Section 8, or you don't have income because you're disabled and you get disability. That's still income. There's also cases where people are applying for a new apartment and they get denied because you're supposed to have 3 months times the rent in salary, and they say you don't meet that requirement. There's a fallacy to that, because when it's really written to keep, in many respects, people who take Section 8 or any kind of assistance voucher program out of running for an apartment, because then they say, hey, it's a $1,200 a month apartment. I'll say $1,000. Let me just say $1,000 because then I can do math. And so you'd have to make $3,000 a month. Well, if you're on Section 8, you're not making $3,000 a month. And so they deny that, but it's based on the contribution you make towards that voucher. Your personal responsibility to that part of that voucher, say, is $250. You only need to make $750 a month, not $3,000 a month. And we're seeing a lot of people denied access to rental units based on that. So there are these organizations, you can go to legal aid and say, I face discrimination. They'll talk to you about it. Does a lot of it get a legally reasonable kind of end game or a judgment? No, it doesn't. It gets overlooked a lot of times. But when you look at the the analysis of impediments to fair housing report we do every 5 years, part of that report is every report of discrimination on housing in Louisville and across the state. So we talk to each of those reporting agencies. They send us all a report of every case that they've had, how far along it's gotten, was there any remuneration to that as well. And so we try to track it, you try to challenge it legally, and you hope the folks that are doing this work that have the lawyers to do it are able to make some gains there. But in a lot of cases, people don't challenge it. They just try to, if you're in housing unstable and you're looking for a house, you're in distress already, and you're just trying to find a safe and affordable place to live. So some people just move on. Yes, sir.
Curious question. Is there a difference between what rental assistance will provide and what the rent actually is? If there is, how is that shortfall handled?
It's all determined by how much what their income is. So if they meet the income eligibility requirements, they have a requirement up to a certain limit, and I can't remember exactly what that is. A recent case I saw, there was a voucher for a family of 6 for I think it was $1,300, $1,400, but the family's requirement was I think it was $173 or $200 of that total. So they have to pay that amount. It's not a total in most cases. Just a voucher covers everything, because that covers utilities as well. So it's rental assistance and it's utility assistance through those programs. Yes, ma'am.
When Louisville looks to plan affordable housing, are they looking at both things, high housing that you may rent? Are they also looking at building houses that you may buy that are, quote, affordable? And if so, do they plan them separately, or is it pretty much included that it's just apartment stuff, not necessarily purchase?
It's both. It's majority apartments, I would say. A lot of developers until recently would only work in one of those two areas. They would either build developments that were single family, or they build developments that were multifamily. It's only recently that you're seeing more developers doing both of those within one development. And as I was talking about with this mixed residential development incentives, that's one of the few tools that it's a unique tool that allows both single family and multifamily in one development, and therefore affordability as a requirement as well within that. So they're looking at both of those to where you can build that. The problem is there's not enough money if you're building single family, you're going to have some other incentives for low income individuals who are making $20,000, $30,000 a year to be able to afford a single home. So there are a lot of complex funding issues that go into that too, and not enough money that comes through governmental entities to be able to do that. So good question though. Yes, ma'am.
I think two things that I've observed here. We moved here 7 years ago, and I was working on 4th Street, and when I drove down, there was like no tents anywhere, and now they're everywhere. I've retired since, and I went downtown the other day, and it was like, there's just tents everywhere. And I don't remember And the other thing that I remember, Leslie, is coming back on Liberty. Somebody was trying to put together a consort of container homes
Mm-hmm.
and make a community there. Is that a planning option that's coming? What happened to that? I don't think it ever got finished.
I'm not exactly sure on that one because I remember didn't come out of there was a I don't remember the name of the group that would have pavement spaces to have convenings of people, and then there were some.
Yeah, it was. I mean, when you said like communities.
Yeah.
I thought of that.
Yeah, I know there were 2 houses that were just in a newspaper recently that were container home houses that were built. I don't remember if it was affordable housing or how it was built. I don't remember much about it, to tell the truth. But it has been part of the conversation, I know.
I thought it was a great solution, and whoever was developing, my understanding was that it would be very low rent.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm not too familiar with the details of that, so I'll definitely look into it more. Other questions? Comments?
One comment, not directly at you, but on our website, anchoragepresbyterian.org, the Matthew 25 tab, we have his presentation already on there. So all those links are clickable through the presentation. All the contact information is on the presentation. Go download it, look at it for yourself so you don't have to squint at these TVs anymore.
And if you have questions, like I said, reach out to me. I'm available. My cell phone number is on my email address and everything, but my email address is up there. Email me. I'll email you back. I'm the only one working in MHC right now, I'll tell you, until I just recently became executive director, so I'm looking to hire a second person. So it might take me a couple days to get back to an email at the moment, but I'll respond as quickly as I can. And if I don't, push me. Please push me. But I'm pretty good about getting back on email. But if you need a phone call, I'm more than happy to have a phone call as well. And we just need voices. We need you to be involved in this work. Advocacy takes a community to do the work. And so I would invite you to be a part of any of the meetings we have on a monthly basis, or to be actively engaged in community conversations on affordable housing and fair housing. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Reminder, we have 2 more of these. Next week, 7 p.m., we are having, who's leading that one? Education. Ann, can you tell us a tiny bit about it next week?
Sure. Yeah. Just real quickly, next week is education, and it'll be the plan is we will have a panel of 4 people. One, either staff or volunteer from Cabbage Patch, talk about their educational opportunities program. The head of the West End School, Dwight Bransford, is going to be here to talk about that tuition-free K through 8 school that includes some boarding options. Very interesting place where I've been doing some volunteer work this past year. You'll want to hear about that. One of his volunteers/mentors is going to come with him, and Mr. Delquan Dorsey, I'm going to try to get this right, Community Connections representative, something like that, with the Diversity and Equity and Poverty Division of Jefferson County Schools. And let me tell you, it is hard to get a hold of somebody in that program. I've worked on it for months. So Mr. Delquan Dorsey is going to be here to talk about what JCPS is doing in the area of diversity, equity, and poverty. So love for you to come and bring a friend. Thanks.
Thank you all.